The stainless tray hit the tile floor with a crash that echoed down the entire corridor of Ashgrove Memorial Hospital. Every head turned. Scalpels, clamps, sterile scissors scattered across the polished floor, ringing like broken bells against each other, before finally going still. "Are you kidding me right now?" Ashley Kane's voice cut through the noise of the hallway, sharp as the instruments at her feet. She spun toward the old man kneeling to gather them, her ponytail whipping over her shoulder. Marcus Whitfield did not look up right away. He set down his mop against the wall first, slow and careful. The way a man moves when he has learned that speed only makes things worse. "I'm sorry, Dr. Kane," he said quietly, already crouching. "I'll have this cleaned and reported within the hour." But it had not been his cart that clipped the tray. It had been hers. Elbow first, phone in hand, eyes on a text message instead of the hallway in front of her. Nobody in the crowd of nurses and orderlies said a word about that. Nobody ever did. A young nurse near the nurses' station opened her mouth as if she might correct the record. She caught the look on Ashley's face, glanced at her own badge. 6 months left on probation, and closed her mouth again. Silence, in a hospital like this one, was its own kind of survival skill. Ashley folded her arms and looked down at him the way someone looks at a stain on a rug. "Do you have any idea how much a full surgical tray costs to re-sterilize?" She didn't wait for an answer. She never did. This is exactly why we shouldn't let custodial staff near a surgical corridor unsupervised. That word, custodial, landed like a slap. A resident nearby covered a laugh with his hand. 2 nurses exchanged a glance and said nothing. Marcus kept his eyes on the floor, on the small silver instruments scattered across white tile, and kept picking them up one by one. Near the supply closet, a young orderly named Malik Johnson paused mid-step, a box of gloves balanced on one hip. He watched the scene for a moment, jaw tightening, then set the box down and crouched to gather the last of the scattered instruments without a word. "You don't have to do that," Marcus murmured. "I know," Malik said, simply, and kept picking up scalpels. Malik had been at Ashgrove 11 months, still new enough to flinch every time Ashley Kane raised her voice. He had already noticed the pattern. Marcus never got credit for the good days. He only ever got blamed for the bad ones. It wasn't fair, and Malik knew it, and knowing it had never once been enough to change it. That was when the elevator doors opened and Richard Sterling stepped out. He moved through hospitals the way certain men move through hotel lobbies. Like the building itself owed him something. Gray 3-piece suit, gold watch catching the fluorescent light, a folder tucked under one arm, thick enough to matter. 2 administrators trailed a half step behind him, the way people trail behind someone whose signature controls their paycheck. What happened here? Richard's voice was flat, already bored with the answer before he heard it. Ashley straightened. Marcus dropped a full surgical tray, contaminated the whole set. It was a lie, small and easy. The kind told 100 times a day, in places where no one questions, the person in the white coat over the person in the blue uniform. Richard did not ask Marcus for his side. He looked at the old man still on his knees, gathering steel instruments into a bin, with hands that did not shake despite his age. Something like contempt settled across his face. "This is a hospital, Marcus," Richard said, loud enough for the whole corridor to hear. "Not a charity ward for men who couldn't cut it as doctors." The words hung in the air of that hallway the way smoke hangs in a room with no windows. A janitor's cart, a drop tray. A room full of people who let the lie stand because the man on his knees had spent 11 years teaching himself not to argue. Marcus's jaw tightened, just barely. His hands never stopped moving. "Understood, sir," he said, his voice even, careful, practiced. He had said versions of that sentence more times than he could count. Richard checked his watch, already turning to go, already speaking to one of the administrators about a budget line item as though the last 30 seconds had never happened at all. He paused just long enough to glance back once. "Get someone else on this corridor for the rest of the shift," he added to Ashley, not even looking at Marcus directly. "I don't need complaints from families about custodial mishaps near a trauma unit." Then he was gone, already checking his watch again, already forgetting the old man's name existed outside of a payroll spreadsheet. Ashley lingered a moment longer than the others, watching Marcus load the last of the instruments onto his cart. For half a second, something that might have been guilt crossed her face. Then her pager buzzed, and whatever that feeling was, she let it go. Put yourself in his shoes for 1 second. 69 years old, on your knees in a hallway full of people who know the truth and say nothing. Listening to a man half your age tell you that you never mattered in the first place. What would you do in that moment? Walk away, say something, or hold it in like Marcus did? Drop a comment below with how you'd handle it. And tell me what city you're watching from and what time it is right now. But stay with me. Because Richard Sterling had no idea what he had just said or who he had just said it to. Outside the hospital's tall windows, the sky over the city had turned the color of wet concrete. On every local news channel playing silently on waiting room televisions, the same red banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. A storm system, larger than forecasters had predicted, was moving in fast. The interstate connecting Ash Grove Memorial to the rest of the county was already showing the first signs of gridlock. 2 counties over, a line of storm cells was stacking up against the mountains. The kind of weather system meteorologists only saw a handful of times each decade. Nobody walking through Ash Grove Memorial that afternoon had any reason to imagine it would matter to them personally by nightfall. Marcus finished collecting the last scalpel, set the bin on his cart, and pushed it slowly down the hallway, past the nurses who wouldn't meet his eyes, past the doctors, who had already moved on to the next thing. Malik walked beside him in silence, for a moment before speaking. "You good?" Malik asked quietly. "I've had worse days," Marcus said. It wasn't a lie, and it wasn't really an answer either. He did not know yet how little time was left before all of that would change. Richard Sterling did not know it either. He had no idea that the man he'd just humiliated in front of an entire hospital corridor had once held a scalpel over hundreds of open chests, in operating rooms far more prestigious than this one. And that 20 years earlier, one of those chests had belonged to his own father. That night, after his shift ended, Marcus sat alone in the break room, with a paper cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. The room was empty except for the hum of a vending machine and the rain starting against the window. He pulled out his phone, an old model with a cracked corner, and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Hey, Grandpa." Zuri's voice came through, tired but warm, the sound of a hospital library in the background. "You still at work?" "Just finishing up," he said, and something in his shoulders loosened just from hearing her voice. She hesitated before she spoke again. He could hear it, that small pause she always made before bringing up money, like she was ashamed of the number, though it wasn't hers to be ashamed of. The financial aid office called again. Zuri said, "62,000 for the year. I told them I'd have an answer by Friday." "How's the anatomy class going?" he asked, turning her worry back into her own life instead of his. Zuri laughed despite herself. "I can name every bone in the wrist now. Ask me anything." "Scaphoid," Marcus said, without hesitation. There was a pause on the line. "Okay, how do you know that?" "Lucky guess," he said, and changed the subject before she could ask again. Marcus closed his eyes. $62,000, more than he made in a year and a half pushing a mop through hospital hallways. "You let me worry about Friday," he said. "You worry about your anatomy exam, Grandpa." Zuri. His voice was gentle but final, the voice of a man who had made this same argument to himself 1,000 times and won it every single time. "I didn't raise you to quit 2 years from the finish line. Not for money, not for anything." She laughed, quiet and a little wet, like she was blinking back something. "I love you, old man. Love you too, baby girl." He hung up and sat there a moment longer, looking at the cracked screen of his phone. 11 years ago, a lawyer had told him what fighting his case properly would cost. Hiring the right experts, pulling the original maintenance logs, taking it all the way to a state hearing. More money than he'd ever see again in his life. 11 years ago, he had a granddaughter to raise and a decision to make. He had made it without a second thought, and he had never once told Zuri what it cost him. He had picked up every double shift the hospital offered since. He skipped lunch more often than he ate it, packed the same turkey sandwich 4 days a week. Every receipt went into a shoebox under his bed, labeled in his own careful handwriting. Zuri, tuition. He never let her see the shoebox. Some sacrifices, he believed, were not meant to be witnessed. They were only meant to work. Some nights, lying awake in the small apartment he shared with no one, Marcus let himself remember the particular quiet an operating room made in the seconds after a save. He didn't let himself remember it often. Memory, he'd learned, was a door best left shut, because behind it was a version of himself he could no longer afford to be. Later that same week, a frightened 8-year-old girl waiting for an MRI began crying in the hallway, refusing to let anyone near her. Marcus knelt down to her eye level and explained, in a low, steady voice, exactly what the machine would sound like and how long it would take. "It's loud," he told her. "But it can't hurt you, I promise. Count to 60 in your head, and it'll already be halfway done." The girl stopped crying. Her mother looked at him like she wanted to hug him. "Are you sure you're not a doctor?" she asked, half joking. "Just a man who's spent a lot of time in hospitals," Marcus said, and wheeled his cart away before she could ask anything else. On his lunch break that same day, hidden in the stairwell where no one ever went, Marcus read 3 pages of a cardiology journal on his phone, the way he did most days. Then he deleted his browser history out of habit and headed back to work. Old instincts, he'd learned, didn't disappear. They just went quiet. The next morning, 3 floors up in cardiac recovery, Dorothy Freeman was finishing her rounds when she found Marcus kneeling beside a patient in the hallway. An elderly man had torn open the tape on his IV site, trying to sit up too fast, blood beading along his forearm. She started toward them, already reaching for gauze, already opening her mouth to call for help. Then she stopped. Marcus had the man's arm steady in one hand. With the other, he was folding a strip of gauze into a butterfly closure. His fingers moved in small, exact motions, tension even, angle precise, the kind of stitch-adjacent technique nobody teaches a janitor. "There," Marcus murmured to the old patient, his voice low and steady. "That'll hold until the nurse gets here. You're all right." Dorothy stood frozen for a second, gauze still in her hand. She had worked in this hospital for 31 years. She had watched interns fumble exact closure 100 times. She had never seen anyone do it that clean, that fast, without looking down even once. "Marcus," she said slowly, "where did you learn to do that?" He glanced up at her, and for half a second, just half a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Then it was gone, folded away as neatly as the gauze in his hands. "Watched enough nurses over the years," he said, standing, brushing off his knees. "Guess it rubbed off." Dorothy didn't believe him. She had known Marcus for 6 years, ever since she transferred to Ashgrove, and in that time she had learned to notice the small things about him that didn't add up. The way he sometimes corrected a chart he wasn't supposed to be able to read. The way certain doctors avoided his eyes in the hallway, like they owed him something they'd rather forget. She thought about mentioning it to someone. She always thought about it, and she never did. Some part of her understood that Marcus's silence was a door he had chosen to keep closed, and it was not her place to force it open. She said nothing more. She simply watched him push his cart around the corner and filed the moment away. Dorothy had buried a husband and raised 2 sons alone on a nurse's salary. If 3 decades in this building had taught her one thing, it was that people rarely ended up mopping floors by accident. Something had happened to Marcus Whitfield. She didn't know what. But she had decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that whatever it was, she would be ready the day it mattered. That afternoon, the hospital's board of directors arrived for their quarterly walkthrough. 7 people in tailored suits moving through the halls behind Richard Sterling, like a small, well-dressed parade. Richard was in his element. He gestured toward the new imaging wing, cited numbers about patient satisfaction scores. He smiled, the practiced smile of a man who had learned exactly which statistics made a board feel good about their investment. "Patient throughput is up 11% this quarter," he said, pausing near a bank of windows overlooking the parking structure. "And our operating margin has improved for the 3rd consecutive year, largely through smart efficiencies across every department." The board members nodded, pens moving across leather folios. Nobody in that group asked what efficiencies meant in practice or how many supply orders had quietly shrunk in the years since Richard took the corner office. They were passing the west corridor when Marcus's cart came around the corner, one wheel squeaking faintly against the tile. Richard's smile thinned. "Speaking of efficiency," he said to the board, not lowering his voice at all, "you'll notice we keep overhead lean here. Every position on this floor earns its budget line." One of the board members, an older woman with silver hair, glanced toward Marcus with mild curiosity. "And is that gentleman part of the tour?" Richard let out a short laugh, the kind meant to invite others to laugh with him. "That's Marcus, custodial." He said the word the same way he'd say a piece of equipment. "You mop floors because you couldn't hold a scalpel without killing someone, Marcus." He turned back to the board without waiting for a reaction. "Don't forget that." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through two of the younger board members. The older woman with silver hair did not laugh. She looked at Marcus a moment longer than the others did, something unreadable crossing her face, before Richard steered the group toward the elevators. Ashley Kane, watching from the nurse's station, with a chart in her hands, said nothing. But for the second time that week, something in Richard Sterling's voice made her feel less proud to work for him than she used to. Elena Vasquez, trailing the group for her own separate compliance review, had noticed something too. Not the insult itself. She'd heard 100 versions of that in 40 years of hospital audits. It was the way the old man's hands never once fumbled while he kept working through it. She made a small note in the margin of her tablet, more out of habit than suspicion, and thought nothing more of it. She would think about it a great deal 24 hours later. Marcus stood very still until they were gone. Then he continued down the hallway, the same slow, even pace as always, his hands steady on the cart. Dorothy, who had been changing a dressing 2 doors down and heard every word through the open door, stepped out into the hallway and watched him go. "One of these days," she muttered, under her breath, "that man is going to say the wrong thing to the wrong person." She had no idea how soon that day would come. Later that evening, Malik found Marcus refilling the supply cart outside the cafeteria and leaned against the wall beside him. "You ever think about reporting him?" Malik asked. "HR, I mean, what he said today in front of the whole board." "And say what?" Marcus said, not unkindly, stacking a row of paper towel rolls. "That the CEO was rude to the janitor. Men like Richard Sterling don't get in trouble for being rude to men like me, Malik. They get promoted for it." Malik didn't have an answer for that. He just nodded and helped him finish loading the cart. They worked in silence for a minute before Malik spoke again, quieter this time. "I'm applying to a PA program next fall," he said. "Haven't told anyone yet. Feels stupid to say out loud." Marcus stopped stacking towels and looked at him properly. "It's not stupid," he said. "It's the opposite of stupid. Don't let this building convince you otherwise." Malik smiled, the first real smile he'd managed all day. "You really think I could do it?" "I think you already are doing it," Marcus said. "You just haven't gotten the piece of paper yet." By early evening, the storm the news had been warning about all week finally reached the city in full. Rain came down in sheets thick enough to blur the hospital's tall windows into gray static. Wind rattled the loading dock doors. On the television bolted to the waiting room wall, a meteorologist stood in front of a red and orange radar map, pointing at a swollen band of color sitting directly over the interstate. And as of 6 o'clock this evening, the anchor's voice crackled through the speaker. The county's main interstate corridor is now completely impassable in both directions, following a multi-vehicle accident near mile marker 40. Emergency crews are advising all drivers to seek alternate routes. Officials estimate the highway will remain closed for the remainder of the evening. A nurse near the desk glanced up at the screen, frowned, and went back to her charting. Nobody in the hospital thought much of it. Storms closed roads every few years. It was at that moment simply weather. Nobody in that building knew yet that every cardiac surgeon on staff at Ashgrove Memorial was, at that exact hour, 2 hours away, at a medical conference on the far side of that very highway. 2 floors down, in the high school gymnasium, attached to the sports complex behind the hospital, the lights of a football field glowed against the storm-dark sky. A stadium full of parents had no idea how close that storm was, about to bring 2 entirely different worlds crashing together. The scoreboard read fourth quarter, 2 minutes left. When Tyler Sterling took a hit from two directions at once. He went down hard, helmet cracking, against another player's shoulder pad, and did not get back up. The crowd's cheering died in one long, terrible wave of silence. A coach sprinted onto the field. A whistle screamed, then screamed again. "He's not breathing, right?" Someone shouted from the sideline. "Somebody call it in, now." 6 minutes later, the ambulance doors burst open at Ash Grove Memorial's emergency entrance. A gurney rolled through at a dead run. A paramedic straddling the boy's chest, counting compressions out loud. 16-year-old male, blunt chest trauma, went into cardiac arrest in the ambulance. The paramedic shouted, breathless as the doors of the trauma bay slammed open. "We need cardiothoracic, now." A young resident grabbed the trauma phone, punched in the on-call line, and waited. It rang 11 times. No one picked up. "Where is everybody?" she yelled, slamming the phone down. There is not a single cardiac surgeon in this building. Word spread through Ash Grove Memorial in under 90 seconds, the way emergencies always do. Nurses grabbing other nurses by the sleeve, doors banging open, a hospital's entire rhythm shifting into something sharper. Malik Johnson was the first to reach the trauma bay with a crash cart, wheels skidding on the tile. Behind him, Ashley Kane came running in scrubs, still damp from a shower she hadn't finished, phone pressed to her ear. "I need every general surgeon we have, right now," she barked into the phone, cutting through the noise of the trauma bay. "I don't care if they've never touched a heart. Get them down here." Over the hospital intercom, a voice crackled through every hallway and waiting room at once. "Code Blue Trauma Bay 1, all available surgical staff Trauma Bay 1 immediately." The announcement repeated twice more. Each time, a little more urgent, a little less certain anyone was coming. A junior resident, panicking, called, "A cardiac surgeon 2 hospitals away," who agreed to try to talk someone through the procedure over video. The call dropped 3 times in a row, the storm straining the hospital's backup generator. "Forget it," the resident said, hanging up for the last time. "We don't have time for a video call to keep failing. We need actual hands in this room." A monitor beside the gurney let out a flat, single tone. "He's in V-fib," a nurse shouted, already reaching for the paddles, 200 miles away. Inside a hotel ballroom filled with the low buzz of a medical conference, a phone rang against a conference room table. It went unanswered, buried under panel discussions and the clink of coffee cups. Outside those hotel windows, the interstate had become a river of red taillights, stretching back for miles in the rain, every lane frozen solid. Every cardiac surgeon Ash Grove Memorial employed was sitting somewhere in that river, phones buried in coat pockets, completely unreachable. Back in the trauma bay, the paddles charged, with a rising electronic whine, somewhere above the chaos. A wall clock ticked past the 4-minute mark. Since Tyler's heart had first stopped in the ambulance, every additional minute without oxygen to his brain narrowed his chances a little further. Though nobody in that room needed a doctor to tell them that. Back in the trauma bay, the paddles charged with a rising electronic whine. "Clear," a resident called out. The boy's body jolted once against the table. The monitor held its flat tone for one more second, then broke into a jagged, uneven rhythm. Alive, but barely. "That won't hold," Ashley said, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of one gloved hand. "He needs an open chest. I can't do that. Nobody in this building can do that." Dorothy Freeman came around the corner, pushing a supply cart, and stopped dead when she saw the chaos through the trauma bay glass. Compressions, shouting, a boy's chest bared under fluorescent light, a heart rhythm that refused to hold. Her eyes found Marcus first. He was 3 feet from the doorway, mop in hand, frozen in place, staring through the glass like a man watching something he recognized from a life he'd buried a long time ago. "Marcus," Dorothy said quietly, stepping closer. "That's a penetrating chest injury. Tamponade, maybe torn pericardium. They don't have a cardiac surgeon in this building." He didn't answer. His jaw worked once, twice, the way it had in the hallway the day before. Except this time his hands weren't steady at all. 34 years, he murmured, almost to himself. "I told myself I was done." Inside the trauma bay, the flat tone from the monitor stretched on again. Ashley Kane's hands hovered over the boy's chest, and for the first time since anyone on staff had known her, her voice cracked. "I've never opened a chest in my life," she said, to no one, to everyone. "I don't know how to save him." It was the first time in her career Ashley Kane had said those 5 words out loud. Something about saying them, about finally admitting the limit of what she knew, cracked something open in her that had been sealed shut since medical school. That was when Dorothy Freeman did the thing she would later say she didn't decide to do. It simply happened, pulled out of 31 years of instinct. She pushed through the trauma bay doors and pointed straight at the man, standing frozen in the hallway with a mop still in his hand. Then, she said the 4 words that would end 11 years of silence. "Get me Dr. Whitfield. Now." The room went still for exactly 1 second. Ashley turned. A resident turned. Even the monitor, for one strange beat, seemed quieter. "Doctor who?" Ashley said, staring at Dorothy like she'd spoken another language. "Marcus," Dorothy said, already moving back toward the hallway. "Dr. Marcus Whitfield, cardiothoracic. He operated in this building for 22 years before any of you set foot in it." A young resident near the doorway whispered something to another, both of them staring now at the old man in the blue uniform standing frozen by the wall. The gymnasium doors at the far end of the corridor burst open, and Richard Sterling came through them, soaked from the storm outside. Tie loosened, face white with a fear none of them had ever seen on him before. Someone from the school had called him the moment the ambulance left the field. "Where is he?" Richard said, not a question, already shoving past a nurse. "Where is my son?" He reached the trauma bay glass and saw Tyler's still body under the lights, saw the flat line stretched across the monitor. Something in him seemed to fold inward all at once. Marcus was already moving. He set the mop against the wall, the same slow, careful motion from the day before. Except now his eyes had changed completely, sharp and fixed and utterly certain. The eyes of a man stepping back into a role he had never actually stopped being. "I need gloves and a gown," he said to Malik, his voice suddenly a different voice entirely. Level, commanding, carrying easily over the noise of the room. "And someone open a thoracotomy tray. We do not have time to wait for a scrub team." Richard spun toward him, grief curdling instantly into rage, and grabbed Marcus by the arm hard enough to stop him mid-stride. "Get those hands away from my son." Richard snarled, his face inches from Marcus's own. "I would rather he die than let the man who murdered a patient touch him again." The words landed across the trauma bay like a gunshot. Nurses froze mid-motion. Ashley's mouth fell open. Even the monitor's alarm seemed to fade into the background of that single, terrible sentence. Marcus didn't flinch. He looked down at Richard's hand on his arm, then up into his face, and for the first time in 11 years, he let the mask fall away completely. "I never murdered anyone," he said quietly, each word measured and absolute. "Elijah Grant died because someone in this hospital cut the surgical budget by 40% and the clamp I was handed failed mid-procedure. I have spent 11 years mopping this floor because I couldn't afford to prove that in a courtroom. Your son does not have 11 years. He has about 4 minutes." Richard's grip loosened, not from agreement, but from shock. In that half-second opening, Marcus pulled his arm free and reached into the inside pocket of his worn blue uniform jacket, the same pocket he had carried something in every single day for 11 years. He pulled out a laminated card, edges soft and rounded from over a decade of handling. He held it up where Richard and Ashley and every nurse in that hallway could see it. A hospital ID, faded but legible, a photograph of a much younger Marcus Whitfield in a white coat, beneath it in raised gold lettering, "Department of Cardiothoracic Surgery." For a moment, nobody in that hallway moved. A resident who had laughed at Marcus in the cafeteria just 2 days earlier stared at the card like it might disappear if she blinked. Malik simply nodded, unsurprised, like some part of him had known all along. "Somebody get me into that operating room," Marcus said. Already walking, already shrugging out of his janitor's jacket and letting it fall to the floor behind him. "Or your son is not going to make it to the next 4 minutes." It was at that exact moment that a woman in a navy suit, badge clipped to her lapel, reading State Medical Board, stepped off the elevator at the end of the hallway. The same silver-haired woman from the board walkthrough the day before. In Ash Grove for a scheduled licensing audit that had, until this second, been the most routine part of her week, Elena Vasquez took one look at the laminated ID in Marcus's hand and went very still. "That credential is 11 years expired," she said, closing the distance fast, pulling a tablet from her bag. "But I know that name. I sat on the disciplinary panel that revoked it." She typed something into the tablet, fast, her eyes scanning the screen. A federal practitioner database, cross-referencing a name against records that had sat untouched for over a decade. The screen loaded slowly, the hospital's aging Wi-Fi, straining under the weight of an emergency. Elena tapped her foot, glancing between the tablet and the trauma bay doors, aware that every second she spent confirming a license was a second. Marcus wasn't yet allowed to use it. Finally, the record populated. Full name, board certification number. Original date of licensure. Every field lined up exactly with the man standing in front of her in a stained janitor's uniform. "Dr. Whitfield," she said, looking up, her voice suddenly careful in a way it hadn't been a moment before. "The malpractice finding against you in the Grant case, it was based on a maintenance log. A log this hospital's own engineering department flagged as incomplete, 3 years after your hearing, in an internal report that was never forwarded to my board." Marcus stopped walking for exactly 1 second. "I didn't know that," he said quietly. "I'm authorizing emergency reinstatement of your license, effective this moment, under provisional review," Elena said, already typing, already moving toward the trauma bay doors alongside him. "Go save that boy, doctor. We'll deal with the rest of it after." Marcus turned to go, and stopped, just for a moment, in front of Richard. 20 years ago, he said quietly, only for Richard to hear, "I operated on a man named Charles Sterling, torn aortic valve. He talked the entire time we prepped him, nervous, the way people get, mostly about his son. Said he was going to run this hospital himself one day, and do it better than anyone before him." Richard went very still. "My father," he said, barely above a whisper. I saved his life," Marcus said. "The same hands you just told to stay away from your son." He didn't wait for a response. He walked toward the scrub room and left Richard standing in the hallway with 20 years of history rearranging itself behind his eyes. Inside the scrub room, Marcus stood at the sink for exactly as long as protocol required, and not 1 second longer, watching the water run pink, then clear, over his hands. A young nurse he didn't recognize tied his gown at the back, her hands trembling slightly. "First time helping in an emergency thoracotomy?" he asked, not unkindly. "Is it that obvious?" she said. "A little," Marcus said. "Stay close to me and do exactly what I say, and you and I are going to keep that boy alive together." Something in her shoulders steadied. "Yes, doctor," she said, and for 11 years nobody had called him that inside these walls. Richard Sterling stood frozen in the hallway, rain still dripping from his suit onto the tile floor, staring at the laminated card that had just fallen from a mop and bucket cart into the hands of a state medical board director, staring at the man he had humiliated in this same hallway less than 24 hours earlier, now walking through swinging doors toward his son's open chest. He had no idea, until that exact second, who he had actually been talking to for the last 11 years. And he had absolutely no idea that the boy dying on that table was about to be saved by the very hands he had just told to stay away. The operating room at Ash Grove Memorial had not seen Marcus Whitfield's hands in 11 years. For the first 90 seconds, his body seemed to remember that fact more than his mind did. Then the tremor in his fingers stopped. All at once, like a switch, thrown somewhere deep in muscle memory that had never actually forgotten. "Retractor," he said, and Malik placed it in his palm before he'd finished the word. "Suction. Now the pericardium's torn along the left border. I need eyes on the bleed, not the monitor." Ashley Kane stood across the table, gowned and gloved, watching a man she had mocked in a hallway less than a day earlier. He moved through a human chest with a calm precision she had only ever seen described in textbooks. "I've never seen anyone find a bleed that fast," she said quietly, almost to herself. You will again, Marcus said, not looking up. Pay attention. This is the part they don't teach you until year 6. A complication arose 18 minutes in. A second bleeder, smaller but stubborn, hidden behind the first. I've got a bleeder at 4 o'clock still going. The anesthesiologist called out, tension climbing back into his voice. Marcus didn't look up. I see it, he said, already adjusting. Ashley, hold pressure here. Exactly where my finger is. Don't move it until I tell you. She did exactly that, not breathing, watching him work around her own hands with a trust she hadn't known she was capable of giving anyone. 90 seconds later, the bleeding stopped. Through the small glass window, set into the operating room door, a small crowd had begun to gather in the hallway outside. Nurses on break. 2 residents who should have been elsewhere. Dorothy standing closest of all, her arms folded tight across her chest. Richard Sterling stood at the center of them, both hands pressed flat against the glass, unable to look away, unable to do anything at all except watch. Dorothy stood a few feet from him, close enough to hear him breathing unevenly. She found she felt no satisfaction in his fear at all, only a tired, complicated grief for how long it had taken this hospital to see what she had always suspected. 40 minutes passed like that. The monitor's rhythm, erratic and thin at first, slowly steadied into something even, something alive. Sinus rhythm restored. A nurse called out, and the entire room exhaled at once. Blood pressure's climbing. He's stable. In a dorm room 2 states away, Zuri Whitfield's phone buzzed with a news alert. She almost swiped away without reading, until she saw her grandfather's name in the headline. She sat frozen on her bed for a long moment, then began to cry, not from worry anymore, but from something that finally, after 11 years, felt like relief. A quiet cheer rose from the small crowd gathered outside the glass. Dorothy pressed a hand to her mouth. Malik pumped his fist once, quietly, the way a person celebrates, so when they're not sure yet if celebrating is allowed. Down the hall, word had already started to spread. Nurses texting nurses, a resident calling her attending, with the phone shaking in her hand. The whole hospital was rearranging itself around a name it hadn't spoken aloud in 11 years. Even Richard, soaked and hollow-eyed, sagged visibly against the doorframe, like a man who had been holding his breath for the better part of an hour. Marcus stepped back from the table, peeled off his gloves, and looked down at Tyler Sterling's chest rising and falling, on its own for the first time in nearly an hour. Close him up, he said quietly to Ashley. You did well in there. Better than you think. Ashley pulled off her own gloves, with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking. Dr. Whitfield, she said quietly, before he could walk away. He turned back. I'm sorry, she said, for the hallway, for the tray, for all of it. Marcus studied her for a moment. Then be better tomorrow than you were yesterday, he said. That's the only apology that ever actually counts in this building. The hallway outside the operating room had filled with people by the time Marcus walked out. Nurses, orderlies, 2 administrators who had come running when word reached the front desk, and Elena Vasquez, tablet still in hand, standing at the center of it all. Richard pushed through the crowd first. For a moment, standing in front of the man who had just saved his son's life, he looked like he might actually say something close to gratitude. Marcus, Dr. Whitfield. Elena cut in, her voice carrying easily across the hallway. And before you finish that sentence, Mr. Sterling, I think everyone standing in this hallway deserves to hear what my board found in the last 2 hours. She held up the tablet, angled it toward the crowd, and began to read. The way a verdict is read, flat and exact, numbers doing the work that outrage alone never could. 11 years ago, a maintenance report was filed by this hospital's own engineering department. It confirmed the surgical clamp involved in the death of patient Elijah Grant had a documented failure history. 3 prior incident reports, all suppressed. Elena's eyes lifted to Richard. That report was never forwarded to my board. It was filed and buried. The same fiscal year this hospital cut its surgical equipment budget by 40% under your signature. Richard's face had gone the color of the tile beneath him. Those numbers are outdated. That was a difficult budget year, every hospital in the state was. 3 other patients. Elena continued, her voice never rising, never needing to. 3 other documented equipment-related incidents in your 9 years as CEO, each one connected to a budget decision with your name on it. Each one settled quietly, out of court, with a confidentiality clause attached. One of them, Elena continued, her voice steady, was a 12-year-old boy who lost partial use of his left hand after a defective suture kit failed during a routine procedure. His family was paid to stay silent. Another was a mother of 3, who nearly bled out after a cut-rate surgical clamp snapped mid-operation, the same model that failed during the grant procedure. 4 years after this hospital was warned to replace them. She looked directly at Richard now. You knew about the clamps years before tonight. There's an email with your name on it. Elena closed the tablet. This isn't just about one bad decision 11 years ago, she said, addressing the whole hallway now, not just Richard. This is a pattern. A hospital that valued its margins over its patients, and a man willing to destroy an innocent surgeon's career to protect it. The state medical board does not treat that lightly, nor should any of you. A murmur moved through the hallway. Ashley Kane, still in her scrubs, stared at Richard with an expression that had nothing left of the confidence she'd carried through this hospital for years. You let everyone believe Dr. Whitfield killed a patient, Elena said. To protect a budget decision you made yourself, and you kept letting them believe it for 11 years. While he mopped the floor of the hospital, you were still running his reputation into the ground in. Richard opened his mouth once, twice, and found nothing behind either attempt. One of the younger board members, the same one who had laughed along with Richard during yesterday's walkthrough, stepped forward now, his face pale. Richard, is any of this true? He asked quietly, almost pleading. Richard didn't answer. The silence answered for him. It was, Dorothy would say later, the loudest silence she'd ever heard in that hospital. Louder than any alarm, louder than any monitor's flatline. The sound of a lie finally running out of places to hide. Effect immediately, Elena said, turning slightly to address the 2 administrators, standing frozen at the edge of the crowd. The state medical board is reinstating Dr. Marcus Whitfield's full surgical license, with a formal public correction to the record of the grant case. I'm also forwarding this hospital's falsified maintenance reports to the State Attorney General's office for review of criminal negligence. One of the administrators, pale, finally found her voice. Mr. Sterling, she said quietly, the board is going to need to meet. Tonight. Richard looked around the hallway. At Ashley, who wouldn't meet his eyes anymore. At Dorothy, arms crossed, watching him the way a person watches, a chapter finally closing. At Marcus, still in his surgical cap, standing exactly where he'd always stood, except that everyone in the building now saw him differently. Nobody in that hallway said a single word in his defense. Security arrived 4 minutes later, not to remove a criminal in handcuffs, just to escort a former CEO to his office to collect his belongings, before the board's emergency session voted, unanimously, to terminate his contract that same night. 2 rooms down, Tyler Sterling opened his eyes for the first time since the field, groggy and confused, machines humming steadily around him. Dad, he mumbled. A nurse leaned in gently. Your father's on his way, sweetheart, she said, though she had no idea, in that moment, whether that was even true anymore. What she did know, and what she told him instead, was the only part of the night that actually mattered. You're going to be okay, she said. A very good doctor made sure of that. 8 months later, the cardiothoracic wing at Ash Grove Memorial had a new plaque beside its entrance, brass and freshly polished, catching the morning light from the hallway windows. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, Chief Surgical Consultant. He walked those halls now in a white coat, instead of a blue uniform. Anyone who watched closely would notice he still stopped to help a nervous new custodian find the right cart. Still greeted every nurse by name. Still moved through the building like a man who had never once believed himself above anyone in it. Dr. Whitfield, a young resident said, jogging to catch up with him in the hallway, folder clutched to her chest. The board wants your notes on the grant case file before this afternoon's ethics seminar. Tell them I'll have it ready, Marcus said, right after I finished teaching a room full of second years how to close a chest properly. The state attorney general's office had spent 7 months building its case against Richard Sterling. By the time it concluded, 3 additional former patients had come forward, each with a story that matched the pattern Elena Vasquez had first uncovered in that hospital hallway. Richard Sterling pleaded guilty to criminal negligence and insurance fraud, was sentenced to 4 years, and stripped of every hospital board position he had ever held in the state. His medical license to ever hold an executive healthcare role again was revoked permanently. Dorothy Freeman was promoted that same year to director of nursing. She filled the role with the same quiet steadiness she'd once used to point a finger down a hallway and change a boy's life. Malik Johnson, encouraged by Marcus himself, enrolled in a physician assistant program that fall, tuition partly covered by the very hardship fund his mentor had helped create. Ashley Kane stayed on at Ashgrove, too. She spent her first year back shadowing Marcus in every surgery he allowed her into, taking notes she never used to take, asking questions she never used to ask. She kept a single sticky note on the inside cover of her surgical notebook, in her own handwriting. Custodial staff built this hospital's best surgeon. Never assume you know someone's whole story. She never took it down. Zuri Whitfield walked across a graduation stage that spring, her grandfather standing in the front row of the audience, on his feet before she'd even reached the podium. The $62,000 that had once kept him awake at night had been paid in full, months earlier, by a state hardship fund created specifically for the wrongfully licensed. The same fund Marcus's case had helped establish. She had chosen cardiothoracic surgery as her specialty. Nobody who knew her grandfather was surprised. That same month, Marcus stood at a small podium in the hospital's main lobby, in front of a crowd that included Dorothy, Malik, and a noticeably humbled Ashley Kane. He unveiled a scholarship fund bearing a name few people in that hospital had ever heard spoken aloud again. The Elijah Grant Memorial Fund. Marcus said, his voice steady, will cover full tuition for one black medical student every year for as long as this hospital stands. Because 11 years ago, a good man lost his life to a decision that had nothing to do with medicine. And I don't intend to let his name disappear into a filing cabinet the way mine almost did. The fund's first recipient sat in the front row, unable to stop smiling. 19 years old, from 3 blocks over, working night shifts at a gas station to save for textbooks. Marcus made a point of shaking her hand personally after the ceremony. Elijah would have liked you, was all he said. The story had made local news within days of that storm-soaked night. Within a month, national outlets picked it up too. A hospital janitor who turned out to be a surgeon, a CEO exposed live in his own hallway. Marcus turned down every television interview request except one, a short segment for a nursing school newsletter, because Dorothy asked him to. Elena Vasquez used the case to push through new statewide legislation, requiring independent review of any malpractice finding tied to equipment failure. Legislation that colleagues now, half-jokingly, called Whitfield's Law. Under the new rule, no hospital in the state could quietly settle an equipment-related malpractice claim without an independent state review first. A small, unglamorous change in a filing procedure. One that would, over the following years, help prevent other Marcus Whitfields from ever losing 11 years of their lives to a hospital's paperwork. He looked out at the crowd for a moment before adding one more thing. I spent 11 years believing the only way to protect my family was to stay quiet and small, he said. I was wrong. The truth doesn't need you to be loud. It just needs you to still be standing when it finally gets heard. If you were Marcus, kneeling on that hallway floor, with a room full of people watching and saying nothing, would you have found the strength to stay quiet for 11 more years? Or would something in you have broken sooner? Have you ever had your ability dismissed because of your age, your job title, or the color of your skin, while the people around you stayed silent? Tell me your story in the comments below, and let me know what city you're watching from tonight. If you believe real talent never expires and never needs anyone's permission to matter, share this video with someone who needs to hear that today. And if you want to keep standing with the people who had overlooked until the moment truth finally catches up to them. Subscribe to Tales of Hidden Strength and Justice, because that's exactly who this channel is for. Before you go, rewind to 31 minutes and 12 seconds. Right when Richard Sterling grabs Marcus's arm in that hallway. Watch his face in the half-second just after Marcus says the word murdered. It lasts less than 2 seconds. But it's the exact moment he realizes he's already lost.